The dust hadn't even settled on the road before Violet Grace felt her father's hand connect with her shoulder, shoving her forward with such force that she stumbled off the wooden porch of their family home. Her carpet bag followed seconds later, landing in the dirt with a dull thud that seemed to echo her father's final words. "You will not disgrace this family by refusing Samuel Whitmore, and if you will not marry him, then you are no daughter of mine." The door slammed shut with such finality that Violet knew there would be no going back, no pleading her case, no changing the mind of a man who valued a business arrangement over his own flesh and blood. She stood there in the scorching Nevada heat of June 1882, watching the door that had just closed on her entire life. 20 years of memories now locked behind painted wood and her father's stubborn pride. Violet bent down to retrieve her bag, her hands shaking not from fear but from the rage that burned hotter than the afternoon sun beating down on Silver Peak. She had known her refusal would cause problems, but she had not anticipated being thrown out onto the street like yesterday's garbage. Samuel Whitmore was 43 years old, twice widowed, and had a reputation for cruelty that extended beyond his treatment of horses. The bruises his second wife had worn before her sudden death from a supposed fall down the stairs had not gone unnoticed by the women of Silver Peak, even if the men chose to ignore such inconvenient truths. Violet would rather starve in the desert than become the third Mrs. Whitmore, and she had told her father as much that very morning. Now, standing in the middle of Main Street with nowhere to go and only the clothes on her back plus whatever she had hastily packed, Violet felt the first tremor of uncertainty creep into her resolve. She had $23 to her name, saved from selling her embroidery work at the general store, and no relatives within 500 miles who might take her in. Her mother had died when she was 12. And her older brother had moved to California years ago, their relationship strained by distance and time. She hoisted her bag onto her shoulder and began walking, not knowing where she was headed, but knowing she could not stand in front of her father's house like a beggar hoping for scraps of mercy that would never come. The main street of Silver Peak stretched before her like a gauntlet of judging eyes. People stopped their conversations to stare as she passed, their whispers following her like a cloud of locusts. Mrs. Henderson clutched her shopping basket tighter and turned away, as if disobedience to one's father might be contagious. Mr. Thompson, who ran the saloon, watched her with an expression that made her skin crawl, the kind of look that suggested he saw opportunity in her misfortune. Violet kept her chin up and her eyes forward, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She had done nothing wrong except refuse to tie herself to a man who might very well kill her before their first anniversary, and she would not apologize for choosing survival over submission. She made it to the edge of town before the full weight of her situation crashed down upon her. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, shimmering waves of heat rising from the sandy earth like phantoms. She had no horse, no wagon, and no realistic way to reach the next town, which was at least 30 miles away across terrain that had killed more experienced travelers than she. The boarding house would not take her without references or advance payment, and she had neither. The church might offer temporary shelter, but Reverend Walsh was a close friend of her father's, and would likely send her right back home with a lecture about honoring thy father ringing in her ears. Violet sank down onto a large boulder at the town's edge, setting her bag beside her and trying to formulate a plan that did not end with her dead in the desert or married to Samuel Whitmore. Perhaps she could find work at one of the smaller ranches outside town, though a single woman traveling alone to seek employment would raise eyebrows and invite trouble. Maybe she could appeal to Mrs. Chen at the laundry, who had always been kind to her, though she doubted the woman could afford to take on charity in the form of a boarder. Every option seemed to lead to a dead end, every path blocked by the simple fact that a woman alone in 1882, Nevada had precious few choices and even less power. She was so lost in her desperate thoughts that she did not hear the approaching horse until it was nearly upon her. Violet looked up sharply, her hand instinctively reaching for the small knife she kept in her pocket, only to find herself staring up at a man astride a massive chestnut stallion. He was tall even sitting down, with broad shoulders and sun-bronzed skin that spoke of years spent outdoors. His dark hair was slightly too long, curling at the edges beneath a well-worn hat, and his eyes were the color of whiskey, warm and assessing as they took in her disheveled appearance and obvious distress. "You look like you are about to attempt something foolish," he said, his voice a deep rumble that carried easily over the desert wind. His gaze flicked to her carpet bag and then back to her face, reading the situation with an accuracy that made her bristle. "That is none of your concern," Violet replied, standing up and brushing the dust from her skirts with as much dignity as she could muster. She did not recognize him, which meant he was likely a drifter or a ranch hand from one of the larger spreads outside town. Either way, she had no intention of explaining her circumstances to a stranger, no matter how kind his eyes might seem. The man swung down from his horse with an easy grace that suggested he had been born in the saddle. He was even taller standing, easily over 6 feet, and younger than she had initially thought, probably no more than 25 or 26. "It becomes my concern when I watch a woman get thrown out of her home and then walk to the edge of town with no supplies and no horse," he said calmly. "I was picking up feed at the general store when your father made his feelings quite clear to anyone within earshot. Samuel Whitmore, really? Cannot say I blame you for refusing that particular fate." Violet felt her cheeks burn with humiliation that this stranger had witnessed her shame, but beneath the embarrassment was a flicker of relief that someone, anyone, seemed to understand why she had made the choice she did. "What I choose to do now is still none of your concern," she said, but the words lacked heat. She was too tired and too scared to maintain her defensive walls against what appeared to be genuine concern. "Name is Reid O'Connor," he said, extending his hand in a gesture that seemed almost quaint given the circumstances. "I run a ranch about 15 miles west of here, near the base of the mountains. Been in town picking up supplies and heard quite a commotion on my way back through." Violet hesitated before taking his hand, her smaller palm disappearing into his calloused grip. "Violet Grace," she said simply, seeing no point in hiding her identity when the entire town would be gossiping about her downfall by supper time anyway. Reid did not release her hand immediately, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a gesture that felt more reassuring than inappropriate. "Here is the situation as I see it, Miss Grace. You have nowhere to go, no way to get there even if you did, and night will fall in a few hours. The desert is no place for anyone unprepared, and I am guessing you have about as much desert survival experience as a newborn kitten." "I am not completely helpless," Violet protested, pulling her hand back and crossing her arms over her chest. "Never said you were helpless," Reid corrected, his tone patient. "Said you were unprepared, which is a different thing entirely. Now I have a proposition for you, and I need you to hear me out before you slap me or tell me to go to hell." Violet raised an eyebrow, waiting. She had already been through the worst her day could offer. She doubted this cowboy could shock her further. Reid took off his hat, turning it in his hands in a gesture that seemed almost nervous. "Marry me instead," he said, the words tumbling out quickly as if he needed to say them before he lost his nerve. "I know it sounds insane, and I know you do not know me from Adam, but hear me out. I need a wife for practical reasons. You need a home and protection, and from what I just heard about your situation, we could help each other." Violet stared at him, certain she had misheard or that the heat had finally driven her mad. "You want me to marry you? I just refused to marry a man my father chose, and now you expect me to marry a complete stranger instead. Have you lost your mind?" "Possibly," Reed admitted, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "But consider the alternative. You stay here. You either crawl back to your father and marry Whitmore, or you try to make it on your own in a town that will not offer you any decent work without a man's permission. You try to leave. You probably die in the desert or get picked up by someone with far worse intentions than marriage. Or you take a chance on me." "Why would you possibly want to marry someone you just met?" Violet demanded, her mind reeling from the absurdity of the conversation. "What practical reasons could you possibly have?" Reed put his hat back on and leaned against his horse, his expression turning serious. "My ranch is successful, but I am fighting a losing battle with the bank and some of the other ranchers who think I am too young and too unmarried to be taken seriously. There is a widow, Mrs. Patricia Simmons, who has been making it known that she expects me to propose any day now, and when I do not, she has threatened to make trouble with my loans and my water rights. Her brother sits on the bank board, and her late husband's family owns half the county. A wife would solve that problem immediately. So you want to use me as a shield against an unwanted suitor?" Violet asked, incredulous. "No more than you would be using me as a shield against Samuel Whitmore and your father's wrath," Reed countered. "I am being honest about my motivations. I need the respectability and security that marriage brings, and you need a home and independence. We could make it a business arrangement if that makes you more comfortable. You would have your own room, your own space, and I would not expect anything from you that you were not willing to give. But you would be safe, fed, and free from Whitmore." Violet wanted to dismiss his offer outright, to tell him he was insane and walk away, but she could not deny the cold logic of his argument. She had no better options, and every minute she stood there arguing with him was another minute closer to nightfall, and another minute closer to her father potentially changing his mind and dragging her back to force her into marriage with Samuel. At least with Reed O'Connor, she would have a choice in the matter, even if it was a choice made under duress. "If I agreed to this madness, and I am not saying I am, what exactly would you expect from me?" she asked carefully. "Help running the household, which currently consists of me and 2 ranch hands who live in the bunkhouse," Reed said. "Cooking, though I should warn you that my current cooking is barely edible, so anything you can do would be an improvement. Maybe help with the books if you can read and write, since my bookkeeping is a disaster. Beyond that, just be my wife in name and public, enough to satisfy the busybodies and the bank. And privately," Violet pressed, needing to know exactly what she would be agreeing to. "Privately, we figure it out as we go," Reed said, his gaze steady and honest. "I am not going to lie and say I would not hope that maybe, eventually, we could make it a real marriage. But I would never force you, never push you into anything you did not want. You would have time to get to know me, to decide if you could tolerate being married to me for real, and if you could not, we would maintain the arrangement as it stands." Violet looked at him, really looked at him, trying to see past the handsome face and earnest words to the man beneath. His clothes were worn but clean, his horse was well cared for, and his hands showed the calluses of hard work rather than violence. He could be lying about everything, could be just as dangerous as Samuel Whitmore, but something in her gut told her that he was telling the truth. Or maybe she was just desperate enough to believe him because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. "We would have to get married today," Violet said slowly, her mind racing through the implications. "If we wait, my father might try to stop it, or Samuel might get involved." Reed nodded. "Reverend Walsh would never agree to marry us without your father's blessing. But there is a justice of the peace in the next town over, in Dusty Springs. We could ride there now, be married by evening, and stay at the hotel overnight. By the time we return tomorrow, it will be done and legal, and there will be nothing your father or Whitmore can do about it." "This is insane," Violet whispered, but even as she said it, she felt herself nodding. "Completely, utterly insane. Does that mean yes?" Reed asked, and she could hear the hope in his voice mixed with disbelief that she might actually agree. "Yes," Violet said, the word feeling both terrifying and liberating. "Yes, I will marry you, Reed O'Connor. God help us both." The ride to Dusty Springs took 4 hours, with Violet sitting in front of Reed on his stallion, her carpet bag secured behind the saddle. The closeness was awkward at first, his arms bracketing her body as he held the reins, his chest solid against her back. But as the miles passed and the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Violet found herself relaxing into the steady rhythm of the horse's gait and the warmth of Reed's presence behind her. They talked in fits and starts, sharing bits of information about themselves like traders exchanging goods. Reed told her about his ranch, the Circle O, which he had inherited from his uncle 2 years ago when the older man had died suddenly of a heart ailment. He had been working as a ranch hand in Colorado when the news reached him, and he had returned to Nevada to find the property barely holding on, debts mounting, and neighbors circling like vultures waiting for him to fail. He had worked himself nearly to death those first 18 months, rebuilding fences, breeding better cattle, and establishing his reputation as a fair but firm employer. The ranch was finally starting to turn a profit, but the social complications of being a young, unmarried landowner were threatening everything he had built. Violet shared less, the pain of her morning's rejection still too raw, but she told him about her mother's death and her father's subsequent obsession with security and status. Samuel Whitmore represented both money and respectability in her father's eyes, and nothing Violet had said about the man's character had swayed his determination to see the marriage through. She mentioned her embroidery work, her love of reading, and her complete lack of experience with ranch life. Reed had laughed at that last confession, a warm sound that rumbled through his chest into her back, and promised to teach her everything she needed to know. Dusty Springs was smaller than Silver Peak, little more than a cluster of buildings around a central well, but it had a justice of the peace who asked no questions when Reed explained their situation in vague terms about needing to marry quickly due to family circumstances. The man, grizzled and practical, had seen enough of life not to judge young people making hasty decisions, and his wife served as witness alongside the hotel clerk. The ceremony took less than 10 minutes, with Violet repeating words that felt both foreign and binding, her hand trembling in Reed's steady grip as he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger. "This was my mother's," Reed said quietly as the ring settled into place. "She died when I was young, but my uncle kept it for me. I know this is not how you imagined getting married, but I want you to have it anyway." Violet looked down at the worn gold band, touched by the gesture despite the strangeness of the entire situation. "Thank you," she whispered, not trusting herself to say more without her voice breaking. The hotel room Reed secured had 2 beds, a fact Violet noted with relief and perhaps a small twinge of disappointment she refused to examine too closely. Reed had been true to his word, treating her with careful respect and maintaining a physical distance that should have comforted her, but instead left her feeling oddly bereft. They ate dinner in the hotel restaurant, a simple meal of steak and potatoes that Violet barely tasted, her mind still struggling to process the fact that she had gone from being a rejected daughter to a married woman in the span of a single day. "Are you all right?" Reed asked as they climbed the stairs to their room after dinner, his hand hovering near her elbow but not quite touching. "I do not know," Violet admitted, unlocking the door with the key the clerk had provided. "I keep waiting to wake up and discover this was all a fever dream brought on by too much sun." Reed followed her into the room, closing the door behind them and leaning against it with his arms crossed. "For what it is worth, I do not make a habit of proposing to women I just met. You are my first and only spontaneous marriage." Despite everything, Violet felt a laugh bubble up from her chest, slightly hysterical but genuine. "I should hope so. I would hate to think I was just one in a long line of desperate women you have rescued from the desert." "Just you," Reed said, his expression softening. "And for the record, I do not think you are desperate. I think you are brave. It takes courage to refuse a match you know is wrong, even when refusing costs you everything." Violet sank down onto one of the beds, her exhaustion finally catching up with her. "I do not feel brave. I feel terrified and uncertain, and like I have just jumped off a cliff without knowing if there is water below." Reed moved to sit on the other bed, facing her with his elbows resting on his knees. "There is water," he said firmly. "I promise you, Violet, I will not let you drown. We will figure this out together, one day at a time, and I will do everything in my power to make sure you never regret taking this chance." She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that this stranger she had just married could truly be her salvation rather than another form of trap. But trust was not something she could conjure on command, not after years of her father proving that even family could betray you. So instead of responding, she simply nodded and began unpacking her few belongings, creating a routine of normalcy in a situation that was anything but normal. They took turns changing into nightclothes behind the privacy screen in the corner, and Violet climbed into her bed with a sense of surreal detachment. Her wedding night, and she was sleeping alone in a hotel room with her husband in a separate bed 6 feet away. It should have been exactly what she wanted given the circumstances, but as she lay in the darkness listening to Reed's steady breathing, she felt a loneliness that went bone deep. She had traded one uncertain future for another, and only time would tell if she had chosen wisely. The next morning, they began the journey back toward Reed's ranch, stopping briefly in Silver Peak only long enough to let Violet's father know she was married and had no intention of returning. They found him at the general store, his face purpling with rage when he saw Violet standing beside Reed, the gold band visible on her finger. Samuel Whitmore was there too, his expression shifting from shock to fury to something calculating that made Violet's skin crawl. "You have made a terrible mistake," her father spat, his words directed at Violet but his eyes fixed on Reed. "You think marrying some no-name rancher is better than the match I arranged. You have thrown away your future out of spite." "I have chosen my own future," Violet corrected, her voice steadier than she felt. "And I would rather build a life with a good man I barely know than spend even one day with a man who killed his last wife." Samuel Whitmore took a step forward, his hand raised as if to strike her, but Reed was faster. He positioned himself between Violet and Samuel, his posture relaxed but ready, the promise of violence clear in every line of his body. "I would not do that if I were you," Reed said quietly, his voice carrying a warning that made even Violet's father take a step back. She is my wife now, under my protection, and anyone who touches her will answer to me. The tension in the store was thick enough to cut, every customer and clerk frozen in place watching the confrontation unfold. Finally, Samuel backed down, his face twisted with impotent rage. "You have not heard the last of this," he said, the threat hanging in the air between them. "Actually, we have," Reed replied calmly. "Violet is legally my wife, and you have no claim on her whatsoever. If you come near her or my property, I will have you arrested for trespassing. And if I hear even a whisper that you are trying to interfere with my ranch or my business dealings, I will make sure everyone in this county knows exactly what happened to your last 2 wives." They left Silver Peak behind with Violet's father shouting curses and threats that faded into the distance as Reed's stallion carried them away from her old life and toward her new one. Violet clung to Reed's waist, her earlier composure crumbling now that they were alone. She did not cry, but Reed must have felt the trembling in her hands because he reached down and squeezed her fingers gently where they were clasped around his middle. The Circle O Ranch appeared on the horizon like a mirage, substantial and real after miles of scrub, brush, and sand. The main house was larger than Violet had expected, a solid 2-story structure with a wide porch and windows that caught the morning light. Outbuildings dotted the property, including a large barn, a bunkhouse, and what looked like a chicken coop. Cattle grazed in fenced pastures, and horses ran in a corral near the barn. It was not grand by any means, but it was well maintained and clearly the product of hard work and careful planning. 2 men emerged from the barn as they approached, both weathered and wary until Reed called out a greeting. He introduced them as Tom Fletcher and Danny Reeves, ranch hands who had been with the property for years. They greeted Violet with surprised politeness, clearly not having expected their boss to return from a supply run with a wife. Reed offered no explanations beyond the basic facts, and the 2 men were smart enough not to ask questions. The inside of the house was clean but sparse, the domain of a man who valued function over decoration. The main floor consisted of a large kitchen with a cast iron stove, a dining area with a solid oak table, and a sitting room with worn furniture arranged around a stone fireplace. Upstairs were 3 bedrooms, the largest of which had clearly been Reed's uncle's based on the heavy masculine furniture and complete lack of personal touches. "You can have this room," Reed said, setting her carpet bag down on the large bed. "It is the biggest and has the best light. I will take one of the smaller rooms down the hall." Violet looked around the space, trying to imagine it as hers. "Where have you been sleeping?" "The smallest bedroom, the one that is barely bigger than the bed itself," Reed admitted with a slight smile. "I always figured this should belong to a couple, and since I was neither, it seemed wrong to claim it." "We are a couple now," Violet pointed out, the words feeling strange on her tongue. "Legally, at least." Reed met her eyes, his expression serious. "Legally, yes. But I meant what I said about not pushing you. You take this room, make it yours, and I will be perfectly content down the hall. When and if you ever want me closer, you only have to say the word." The first weeks of her marriage passed in a blur of new routines and constant adjustments. Violet threw herself into learning how to manage the household, determined to uphold her end of their bargain. She discovered that cooking on a wood stove was vastly different from the small oven her family had owned, and her first attempts at bread resulted in dense bricks that even the chickens refused to eat. Reed ate them anyway, pronouncing them the best terrible bread he had ever tasted, and showed her the tricks his uncle had taught him about temperature and timing. She took over the bookkeeping as well, her neat handwriting and basic mathematics bringing order to the chaos of Reed's record keeping. She discovered that the ranch was doing better than Reed had let on, though his concerns about the bank and the social politics were valid. There were several notes indicating that loans were coming due, and correspondence from Patricia Simmons that ranged from sweetly manipulative to barely concealed threats about what might happen if Reed continued to spurn her attentions. She visited yesterday, Tom mentioned one afternoon while Violet was hanging laundry. Mrs. Simmons, came by all dressed up like she was expecting a social call. Reed told her he was married now, and she about near fainted. Then she got angry, said it was not possible since she had not heard any announcements. "What did Reed say?" Violet asked, trying to keep her voice neutral even as a possessive anger flared in her chest at the thought of this woman pursuing her husband. "Showed her the marriage certificate and introduced me as a witness to the fact that you were living here as his wife," Tom said with a satisfied grin. "She left in a huff, but I do not think we have seen the last of her. Woman like that does not take rejection well, especially not when it costs her what she was after." Tom was right. Patricia Simmons made 3 more visits over the next 2 weeks, each time dressed more elaborately than the last, each time finding new excuses to stop by the ranch. Violet met her on the 3rd visit, opening the door to find a woman in her late 30s with carefully styled blonde hair and a dress that must have cost more than Violet's entire wardrobe. Patricia looked her up and down with barely concealed disdain, taking in Violet's simple work dress and the flour dusting her hands from the biscuits she had been making. "So you are the mysterious wife," Patricia said, her tone dripping with condescension. "How convenient that Reed found someone to marry just when I was about to accept his proposal." "Reed never proposed to you," Violet replied, keeping her voice pleasant despite the fury building in her chest. "And even if he had, he is married to me now, so your acceptance or lack thereof is irrelevant." Patricia's smile sharpened. "Marriage can be annulled, especially hasty ones entered into under questionable circumstances. I have friends at the courthouse who could make things very difficult for you." "Is that a threat, Mrs. Simmons?" Reed's voice came from behind Violet, and she turned to find him in the hallway, his expression cold in a way she had never seen before. "Because if you are threatening my wife, we are going to have a serious problem." "I am simply stating facts," Patricia said, but her confidence wavered under Reed's stare. "Your marriage seems rather sudden, and people are talking. They are wondering if perhaps Miss Grace was already in a compromising position before you so gallantly rescued her." Violet felt the words like a physical blow, the implication clear. Patricia was suggesting that Violet had been ruined, that the marriage was a cover for scandal rather than a legitimate union. It was a lie that could destroy what little reputation Violet had left, and damage Reed's standing in the community he was working so hard to be accepted in. Reed stepped forward, placing himself between Violet and Patricia with a protective instinct that made Violet's heart stutter. "My wife's reputation is spotless, and anyone who suggests otherwise will find themselves answering to me and my lawyer. Now, I am going to ask you to leave my property, Mrs. Simmons, and I am going to strongly suggest that you not return. If you or your brother or anyone associated with you attempts to interfere with my loans, my water rights, or my business in any way, I will make sure that everyone in this county knows exactly why you are so angry about my marriage." "You would not dare," Patricia breathed, her face paling. "Try me," Reed said flatly. "I have been patient with your pursuit because I did not want to embarrass you, but that patience is at an end. Leave Violet alone, leave me alone, and we will all pretend this conversation never happened." Patricia left without another word, her departure marked by the angry clatter of her expensive carriage on the dirt road. Violet sagged against the doorframe once she was gone, the adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation draining away and leaving her shaky. Reed turned to her immediately, his hands hovering near her shoulders as if he wanted to touch her but was not sure if he should. "Are you all right?" he asked, concern evident in every line of his face. "I did not realize being married to you would make me a target," Violet said, trying for humor but hearing the tremor in her voice. "I am sorry," Reed said, and he sounded genuinely miserable. "I knew Patricia would be angry, but I did not think she would come after you directly. I should have warned you, should have prepared you better." Violet straightened, pushing away from the doorframe and squaring her shoulders. "I do not need protecting from spiteful women, Reed. I can handle Patricia Simmons and anyone else who wants to make trouble. I just need to know that you have my back if things escalate." "Always," Reed said immediately, and the intensity in his voice made something warm unfurl in Violet's chest. "I meant what I said in Silver Peak. You are under my protection now, and I take that responsibility seriously." The problem was that Violet was beginning to realize she wanted more than Reed's protection. She wanted his attention, his affection, his everything. It had crept up on her slowly over the past weeks, the way her heart would lift when she heard his footsteps on the porch at the end of the day, the way she found excuses to bring him coffee while he worked on the books in the evening, the way she lay awake in her large bed at night thinking about him sleeping alone just down the hall. She was falling for her husband, this man she had married out of desperation and convenience, and she had no idea if he felt anything for her beyond friendly obligation. Her answer came one evening about 6 weeks into their marriage. Violet had been experimenting with pie recipes, determined to master the desserts that Reed mentioned loving as a child. She had just pulled an apple pie from the oven, the crust golden and perfect, when Reed came in from checking the cattle. He stopped in the doorway, watching her with an expression she could not quite read as she set the pie on the counter to cool. "Something wrong?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious about the flour in her hair and the sweat staining her dress from the heat of the stove. "No," Reed said slowly, still not moving from his position in the doorway. "I was just thinking that I am a very lucky man. Because I finally made a pie that did not burn," Violet teased, trying to lighten the sudden tension in the room. "Because I get to come home to you every day," Reed corrected, his voice going rough. "Because you are here, making my house a home, fighting off social vultures, and learning to cook on that temperamental stove. Because somehow, impossibly, I got to marry the bravest, most stubborn, most beautiful woman I have ever met." Violet's breath caught, the wooden spoon she had been holding clattering to the floor. "Reed." He crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping just close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "I know we agreed this was a business arrangement," he said, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides as if he was physically restraining himself from reaching for her. "And I know you need time to trust me, to trust this. But I need you to know that this stopped being just business for me about 3 days after I brought you here. I am falling in love with you, Violet, and I am terrified that you will never feel the same way." "You idiot," Violet whispered, and then she was reaching for him, her flour-dusted hands fisting in his shirt as she pulled him down to her level. "I have been lying awake every night wishing you would knock on my door, wondering if you were ever going to see me as more than an obligation." Reed's eyes widened, hope and disbelief warring in his expression. "You want me to knock on your door? I want you to stop treating me like I am made of glass," Violet said, her voice fierce. "I want you to kiss me like you mean it, to hold me like I am not going to break, to be my husband in every sense of the word." Reed did not need to be told twice. He kissed her like a man dying of thirst who had finally found water, his hands cupping her face with a gentleness that belied the hunger in his kiss. Violet kissed him back with equal fervor, pouring weeks of longing and uncertainty and growing love into the contact. They broke apart only when breathing became necessary, both of them panting and disheveled and grinning like fools. "I love you," Reed said against her lips, the words a promise and a prayer. "I know it is too soon. I know we barely know each other, but I love you, Violet O'Connor." Hearing her married name from his lips sent a thrill through her entire body. "I love you too," she admitted, the words feeling right and true and absolutely terrifying. "I did not want to, I was not planning to, but I do. I love you, Reed." That night, Violet did not sleep in the large bedroom alone. Reed carried her upstairs with a tenderness that made her eyes sting, laying her on the bed that had been theirs all along, even if they had been too scared to claim it together. He made love to her with patience and care, learning her body like a map he was determined to memorize, whispering endearments against her skin until she shattered in his arms. Afterward, lying tangled together in the moonlight filtering through the windows, Violet felt a peace she had not known since her mother died. She was home, truly home, in a way that had nothing to do with buildings and everything to do with the man holding her like she was precious. The months that followed were not without challenges. Patricia Simmons made one final attempt to cause trouble with the bank, but Reed's threat had not been idle. He quietly let it be known that he had documentation of Patricia's less than ethical business dealings with other ranchers, and suddenly all interference with his loans ceased. Violet's father sent a single letter 6 months after her marriage, a stiff formal thing that acknowledged her new status but made no apology for his actions. Violet read it once and then burned it in the stove, Reed's arms around her waist as she watched her past literally go up in smoke. The ranch continued to prosper, with Reed's hard work and Violet's efficient management transforming the Circle O into one of the most successful operations in the region. They hired 2 more ranch hands and bought a neighboring property that doubled their grazing land. Violet started a garden that became the envy of every woman in 3 counties, and her preserves sold at the general store for premium prices. She also started teaching reading to some of the children of ranch workers in the area. The small schoolroom she set up in the unused downstairs office becoming a source of pride for both her and Reed. Their first Christmas together was a revelation, with Reed insisting on cutting down a small pine tree and decorating it with popcorn strings and paper ornaments Violet made. They attended the Christmas service in Silver Peak, walking in together with their heads held high, ignoring the stares and whispers. Violet saw her father across the church and met his eyes without flinching, her hand secure in Reed's grip. Whatever he saw in her face must have convinced him that she was truly lost to him, because he looked away first, his shoulders slumping in what might have been defeat or regret. Spring brought the news that Violet was pregnant, a discovery that sent Reed into a panic of joy and terror that would have been comical if it had not been so endearing. He treated her like she was made of spun sugar, trying to prevent her from doing any work until Violet threatened to brain him with a skillet. They compromised with her taking on less physical labor and Reed hiring a woman from town to help with the heavier housework. Mrs. Chen's niece, a cheerful girl named May, became not just an employee but a friend, her presence making the house feel even more like home. Samuel Whitmore died that summer, found at the bottom of his stairs with a broken neck in an echo of his second wife's fate. The official verdict was accidental death, but the whispers suggested that his current mistress, a woman he had been courting to become his 3rd wife, might have helped him on his way. Violet felt no satisfaction at the news, only a bone-deep relief that she had escaped that fate, and a prayer of gratitude for the cowboy, who had offered her a different path. Their son was born in October of 1883, a squalling red-faced baby boy they named James Thomas O'Connor after Reed's uncle. Reed cried when the midwife placed the baby in his arms, tears streaming down his face as he counted tiny fingers and toes and marveled at the miracle they had created. Violet, exhausted and sore and deliriously happy, watched her husband fall in love with their son and felt her own heart expand to accommodate even more love than she thought possible. 2 years later, a daughter joined their family, a dark-haired beauty they named Margaret Rose after Violet's mother. She was followed 2 years after that by another son, Robert Daniel, who had his father's whiskey-colored eyes and his mother's stubborn chin. The house that had been built for a lonely bachelor became filled with the chaos and joy of children, with toys scattered across the floor and crayon drawings decorating the walls and laughter echoing through every room. Violet's father never met his grandchildren, dying of pneumonia when James was 3 years old. He left everything to a cousin in California, cutting Violet out of his will as thoroughly as he had cut her out of his life. She mourned the relationship they should have had more than the man he actually was, and Reed held her through her grief without judgment or platitudes. The only thing she kept from her father's estate was her mother's wedding ring, which she put on a chain and wore around her neck as a reminder of the love that had once existed in her family. The Circle O continued to grow and thrive, becoming one of the largest and most respected ranches in Nevada. Reed's reputation evolved from that of a struggling young rancher to a pillar of the community, sought out for advice by newcomers and old-timers alike. Violet's literacy program expanded into a proper school, with the county eventually providing funds for a teacher's salary and supplies. She taught there herself for years, until the demands of 3 active children and the ranch made it impossible to continue full-time, but she never stopped believing in the power of education to change lives. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Reed took Violet back to Dusty Springs, to the same hotel where they had spent their wedding night a decade earlier. The room looked exactly the same, down to the 2 beds that had remained empty on opposite sides of the room. They laughed about it now, about the scared, desperate woman and the crazy cowboy who had gambled everything on a stranger. "You ever regret it?" Reed asked as they lay tangled together in one of those beds, their 10 years of marriage and 3 children making the question almost absurd. "Not even for a second," Violet said honestly. "You saved my life that day, gave me everything I never knew I wanted." "You saved mine right back," Reed countered, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I was going through the motions of living, building something I did not even really want because I thought I was supposed to. You made it all mean something, made me want to build a life, not just a successful ranch." They stayed in Dusty Springs for 3 days, a second honeymoon funded by years of hard work and careful saving. They talked about everything and nothing, made love like newlyweds, and planned for the future they were still building together. When they returned to the Circle O, it was to 3 excited children and a ranch that ran smoothly thanks to Tom and Danny's experienced management. Home had never looked so good, never felt so right, never been so absolutely perfect. The years continued to pass, marked by the usual milestones of ranch life and raising children. James grew tall and serious, showing an early aptitude for working with horses that made Reed beam with pride. Margaret became her mother's shadow, learning to read before she turned 5 and declaring her intention to be a teacher like her mama. Robert was the wild card, adventurous and fearless, giving his parents more gray hairs than his siblings combined, but charming everyone he met with his infectious grin. On particularly quiet evenings, after the children were in bed and the ranch work was done, Reed and Violet would sit on their porch and watch the sun set over the desert that had nearly swallowed her whole all those years ago. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they sat in comfortable silence, but always they were together. Two people who had taken an insane chance on each other and won everything that mattered. "I love you," Reed would say, the words as fresh and true as they had been in that flour-dusted kitchen so many years ago. "I love you too," Violet would reply, her hand secure in his, her future certain in a way it had never been before she met a cowboy who caught her at her lowest point and offered her the world. Their story became the stuff of local legend. The tale of the woman thrown out for refusing to marry and the cowboy who caught her and said, "Marry me instead." People told it at gatherings and whispered it to their daughters as proof that sometimes the right person came along at exactly the right moment, even when that moment looked like the worst day of your life. The details changed with each telling, growing more dramatic and romantic, but the core truth remained the same. Two strangers had taken a leap of faith and landed exactly where they were meant to be, building a love that would last until their final days and beyond, into the memories of their children and grandchildren and all who came after. Years later, when Violet was an old woman with silver in her hair and Reed's hand still firmly clasped in hers, she would think back to that day in June 1882, when her world had ended and begun again in the span of a few hours. She would remember the terror and the desperation, the insane proposal from a stranger, and the decision that had changed everything. She would remember the way Reed had looked at her, really looked at her, and seen not a problem to solve but a person worth saving, worth cherishing, worth loving. And she would smile, grateful beyond measure that she had been brave enough or desperate enough or both to say yes to the cowboy who had caught her when she fell, and had spent the rest of his life making sure she never had reason to regret it. They had built something beautiful from the ashes of her old life, something real and lasting and true, and in the end, that was all that mattered. The circle O would pass to their children, and then their children's children, but the love story at its foundation, the tale of Reed and Violet O'Connor, would live on forever, a testament to the power of taking chances and the magic of finding home in the most unexpected places and people.